All right, so welcome to day 6 of International Pastries. We're going to be discussing mousse and Bavarian cream and other aerated dessert components. Um, Aerated desserts are some of the most popular in all of baking and pastry for plated desserts and for just for their lightness. You can take something that is very rich and full of calories and make it feel a lot lighter and very, very pleasant mouthfeel. So we have lots of different mousses and creams that we use in the whole world of baking and pastry. Let's take a look at some of the things we're going to be focused on here in this part of our class. Understanding the differences, similarities between mousse and other aerated dessert components, the proper preparation of mixing of mousse and Bavarian cream, what makes them different, and why we would choose one over the other. And really take a dive into gelatin. We spent some time looking at gelatin in previous classes, but we need to really get to know gelatin well because gelatin is a very big part of what we do in baking and pastry. We use it as a stabilizer for mousses, but also for many other things. So we really need to get a good handle on how gelatin works and the differences between sheet gelatin and powdered gelatin. We're going to look at the various applications and how we can use mousse. You know, mousse, it can be served in many different ways. All these different creams can be used in different ways. And they're all very useful in their own way. And of course, we're going to take a look at the best practices of preparing aerated preparations. There are certain things you can do to make sure you're going to have good product quality. And if you skip any of them, you could very easily end up with a mousse that collapses. You can end up with a cream that gets curdled, that doesn't hold up under its own weight. There's a lot of things, a lot of quality issues that we can run into. Let's take a look at gelatin. Sheet gelatin typically weighs about 1/10 of an ounce each. So basically 10 sheets is equal to 1 ounce. And for all intents and purposes, when you're talking about an ounce of sheet gelatin, it has basically the same it's basically the same as powdered gelatin. But we'll take a look at that because there are some small differences. The big difference here with sheet gelatin is that it is soaked in cool water to bloom. That word bloom is named after Dr. Bloom, who really, back in the 1800s, he really started to develop better methods for purifying gelatin. The great thing about sheet gelatin is you don't need to measure anything when it comes to the water. It just soaks up what it needs in about 5 minutes. You pull it out of the water, you squeeze off the excess water, and you're ready to use it. Powdered gelatin, however, must be bloomed in exactly 8 times its weight in water. So if you have 1 ounce of gelatin powder, you must use 8 ounces of water, cool water. The idea there is that powdered gelatin is made in a standard form so that it will soak up a certain amount of water, and that makes it activated. It's properly bloomed, and it really needs that ratio. Most recipes already have the gelatin ratio calculated and tested for you, so oftentimes if you just follow the directions in the recipe, you're going to be just fine. But if you do need to make conversions, you're going to want to make a note of this chart in the next slide. I've gone over the internet, spent a lot of time researching different all these different opinions about gelatin, and basically we came up with a consensus. Remember, all these measurements are by weight, but basically when it comes down to gelatin, Knox gelatin, the powdered gelatin we use here in America, has a gelatin bloom strength, what we call a gel strength, of 225. Leaf gelatin or sheet gelatin in the gold form is about 200. And silver gelatin is typically about 160. Now, what do those numbers mean? Well, those are relative measurement terms of their gel strength and how firm the product will be, all things being equal. If you need to make a conversion, let's say you have sheet gelatin in your place of business or wherever you're working, but the recipe calls for Knox gelatin. So let's say you have sheet gelatin and it's gold. It's the gold version, and it'll say that on the box. You could say, well, my recipe calls for, let's say, half an ounce of Knox gelatin. I would then go down this chart here and say, okay, I'm going to multiply Knox gelatin times 1.06 to get the measurement for gold, for the gold gelatin. If I wanted to make a conversion between any of the others, I could do the same. We can do this by weight. Now remember, we have to use a scale, and we have to be very careful with the weight. But basically, when it comes down to it, what these conversions are designed to do is to help you account for the gel strength based on the weight of the gelatin you're using, so that you don't end up with a dessert that is too rubbery because you put so much more gelatin in it at a higher strength than it was calling for, or it falls, or it's too mushy and too soft and it doesn't hold its own weight. It's important to get it right because, after all, who wants to eat a dessert that's just too rubbery? So make note of this. I'll have a handout for you on this, and it has all the conversions so that if you ever need them, you can pull them out. What I did with this chart was I took a photograph of it and I put it in my phone. That way I can easily find it, and I saved it in my phone so that whenever I need it and need to make a quick conversion, I can quickly go to my chart. So what do all aerated preparations have in common? Well, chocolate mousse, Bavarian cream, and fruit mousse all include basic ingredients. So you have a basic flavorful base. That's the base, and it has all the flavor in it. It could be, in the case of fruit mousse, it could be fruit puree. In the case of Bavarian cream, we typically use a custard, and in the case of other types of like chocolate mousse, we use chocolate and oftentimes cooked and sugared eggs. But the flavorful base is the most important thing. You could make mousse out of anything. You could take salmon, for example, cook the salmon, puree it into a paste, and then season it, and that would be your flavorful base. And then all mousses have an aerating agent or aerator. So that could be, in the case of some mousses, it could be egg whites, like a meringue. In other mousses, it can be whipped cream, but it always has something to give it air. And then it always has some form of stabilizer. A lot of mousses used gelatin as their stabilizer, so that's what helps it set when it gets cooled off. But cocoa butter is typically used in certain traditional red chocolate mousse recipes because cocoa butter will harden at room temperature, and it'll harden also when it's cooled down. And some chocolate mousse recipes do call for just chocolate because it has enough cocoa butter in it to set the mousse. But don't be discouraged if you ever see gelatin being used in a chocolate mousse, because it is perfectly okay to do that. But basically, there we go. A flavorful base, an aerator, and a stabilizer. They all have similar texture. They're aerated, they're light, and they're smooth. That's one thing that makes all mousses the same. And then they can all be served immediately in glasses or bowls, because in glasses or bowls you have a container to hold it in, so it won't run over the plate. It won't slump because it's being held up by a glass or by a bowl. All can be dispensed into a mold for serving as a standalone dessert element. There are many times we make things out of mousse where we're going to put them in a mold and we're going to remove them from the mold before it's being served. That means that the mousse needs to be strong enough, needs to be sturdy enough, and be stabilized well enough to be able to hold up under its own weight against gravity and be able to stand alone on the plate. That means oftentimes using a fair amount of stabilizer to do the job, but when you're using molds, you can get some really creative effects. So a basic chocolate mousse, classic chocolate mousse, involves using egg yolks and sugar that are heated and whipped. So they're heated enough so that the egg yolks start to cook. They just start to cook. They don't get like scrambled eggs. They just start to thicken. And then they're whipped to full volume, and then melted chocolate is added, and finally whipped cream is added to lighten the mixture and give it air. Chocolate mousse does have many variations. One particular variation that is a lot of fun is using melted chocolate an Italian meringue, which is a very sweet meringue, and then lightening it further with whipped cream. That can make it a very light but very sweet chocolate mousse. Gelatin is optional because cocoa butter will set the mousse, but a lot of times when you're going to be serving it to stand on its own without a mold or without a glass or a bowl, you oftentimes need that gelatin to give it some extra support. So if you're going to be using lower quality chocolate that has less cocoa butter in it, that's one reason why we would use gelatin. And also, when it's going to be used, let's say, plated as a single standalone element. It can also be when it's during warm weather. Well, sometimes mousses that I would ordinarily not use much gelatin in, I might use a little bit more when it's really warm weather, or if the item is going to sit on a buffet for a while before people come over to consume it. So the next is Bavarian cream. Bavarian cream is based on a stirred custard. So we typically will make creme anglaise, which is a vanilla sauce, essentially. It's basically an egg-based sauce made with egg yolk, sugar, cream, and vanilla. That's your basic flavorful base for Bavarian cream. Usually then we add gelatin that's been bloomed, but then also melted and added to the custard base. Any other flavorings can be added at that point too. You can make a chocolate Bavarian cream. You can make a strawberry Bavarian cream. You can add really strong flavorful extracts and compounds and purees to that stirred custard base. Finally, once everything has been cooled down, whipped cream is folded in last, and the gelatin will help it set, and the finished cream is usually piped in either molds, or in some cases it's in a cake ring, for example, and Bavarian cream might become part of a layer of a cake. Now, fruit mousse is really different because fruit mousse, it relies on fruit puree and sugar. There are other flavorings that can be added, like a little lemon juice or lime juice can be added for tartness and things like that. But like a strawberry mousse is basically just pureed strawberries that have been filtered so all the seeds are removed, and then sugar is added to taste. Lemon and passion fruit purees require far more sugar than other fruit, for example, though. Lemon is very strong by itself, so to balance that strong acidity with some sugar is necessary. And passion fruit, if you've never tried passion fruit, it's about as tart as a lemon, so it needs far more sugar than something like a banana puree or a strawberry puree. Fruit puree must be stabilized with gelatin in order to hold, unless it's going to be served in a glass or in a bowl. It's very typical to make fruit mousse and serve it in a champagne glass, for example, or in a martini glass, and to garnish that with fresh fruit of a similar or complementary flavor. In that case, you wouldn't really need the gelatin if you have a glass or you have some other container you're using for service. So, applications. We can serve it in a glass, right? That's a great way to serve mousse. It's easy. You can pre-prep the mousse well in advance, put it in the glasses, cover it and keep it in the refrigerator, and it will last, for a couple of days. So you can pre-prep a lot of these in advance if you're going to be serving a lot of people. No gelatin is needed, again, because you are going to be using a glass in this case. It can be a very attractive presentation, especially when you think of all the different type of glassware you can use, and it works great for banquet service, for large groups and things like that. So it's a great way to serve it, and you can make a very tasty, but also a really very attractive looking dessert for large groups of people. But we can also serve it as a standalone dessert. However, a mousse cake like the one you see pictured is a bit vulnerable to things like vibration, to being moved from one place to another, and it's also very vulnerable to room temperature. So you want to make sure that when you're going to be preparing something, for example, like this, that's going to be standing alone, that it needs to have enough stabilizer in it, enough gelatin to do the job, and that it will survive being transported from where you prepared it to the dining room where people will be eating it. The worst case scenario would be where all of your mousse starts to soften at room temperature and then starts falling over or collapsing because it doesn't have enough stabilizer in it. Cake layers are often used in the middle in these, both on the base, but also at least one in the middle in order to not only give different texture, but also it acts actually as a way to strengthen the mousse cake so that it holds together better and it's more stable. So, best practices. Aerated components such as mousse and creams, they need to be prepared immediately before serving or piping into molds. The reality is that you're working with something with gelatin in it or cocoa butter. And because of that, it can set really fast, even at room temperature, and it can become rather grainy and rough and not nearly as attractive as it should be if you delay. So once you are thinking about making, let's say, some mousse cakes for dessert, you want to make sure that you have all of your items ready. You've got your molds ready. You've got your cake layers ready. You've got anything else you're going to be putting in them. Get your piping bags ready, piping tips. Have all of your mise en place ready before the mousse is made. So anything that needs to be prepared in advance needs to be prepared before the mousse is done. Once you make that mousse, or Bavarian cream, or fruit mousse, the very last thing is that mousse, and it gets prepared and immediately dispensed into containers. That way it stays as smooth as possible. You really have to manage those stabilizers carefully, because if your mousse starts to set at room temperature because the gelatin starts to set, there's no going back. You can't remelt it. If you remelt it, if you try to warm it up, well, what's going to happen is the warmth is going to cause your whipped cream to collapse. So you need to make sure that you get it right the first time. If you try to let's say warm it up, you could ruin the whole mixture, and then you just have to throw it away and start over. So whipped cream, it must be kept cold and mixed with cold temperature or room temperature base mixtures. If that base mixture is even the slightest bit warm, it'll cause the whipped cream to collapse. Whipped cream, remember, is held together by basically very small microscopic bits of butter that are in the cream. Butter melts at 88 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a really low temperature if you think about it. I mean, how many times have you worked in a kitchen that's over 88 degrees Fahrenheit? I know I have, and you probably have too, and if you haven't, you will. When it's that warm, whipped cream is really hard to manage because it's so warm it's starting to melt. So I always whip the cream to medium peak. Some recipes will call for soft peak. But anything beyond medium peak, it will start to get grainy and get too stiff. It also gets more difficult to fold in. So if you go too soft, then the mousse will be runny and it'll be hard to manage as well. So I always like to go medium peak because the cream holds its own shape, and it generally still has a beautiful smooth texture. So following these basic guidelines, you will be able to always have a beautiful mousse. We're going to, of course, demonstrate this in class, and you're going to be preparing a mousse in the next lab, preparing your mousse cakes, getting them ready, and we're going to be going into our next project, which will be plating our first dessert. So we're going to be doing a mousse cake as our dessert, and you're going to want to get your mousse prepared and put into molds and chilled so that it's ready the next day. We'll be doing our plating tomorrow. So it's ready the next day, so the stabilizer has had a chance to firm, and it's much easier to handle at that point. Before we bring them out, we're going to take them over to the blast chiller and get them really cold, and we're going to get them frozen so that they're much easier to unmold and much easier to manage. But this also means that in a plated dessert, you're going to need other components besides just your mousse cake. If you look ahead to our next day in Talon and start looking at the videos I've presented for you about plating, some of the things that you'll read about in there is that a plated dessert always has 3 elements. It always has a main item, a sauce, and a garnish. So today in lab, you're going to be assembling your mousse, but you're also going to be starting to think about preparing your sauce, preparing any garnishes that you're going to be using, because you don't dive into a plated dessert without any plan. You have to have a plan so that you know where you're going to be going, and you can pre-prep all of those items. So when we get into the lab, I will be, doing a demo, and have you dive right in, and we're going to be getting our mousse cakes prepared. At the very minimum, we're going to make sure that we have our mousse prepared and chilled and ready to store overnight in the refrigerator so that it's ready to be plated. So bring yourself, bring your uniform, bring your mask. We'll see you in the lab.